Our first speaker, and I really want to thank her for being here today, is Karen Clark. Give a little bio here. She is the Planning Specialist, Portland office, U.S. Department of Labor. Karen's been with the Department of Labor for 16 years, and she is currently the Community Outreach and Resource Planning Specialist for the Portland District Office. And prior to her current position, Karen worked as an investigator for the department. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen.
I'm not going to use this actually, so let me know if you can't hear me. I'm going to get confused.
There's a handout. I hope everybody got one of these from Cameron. We got them around.
So, thank you so much, Tom. Thanks for the invite. I can tell that he's really vested in getting you as an audience the knowledge you need to move forward successfully with your business. And what I want to do is give you information on the labor laws that we enforce. Now, as you all know, there's been a lot of information out there that we've done a lot of investigations. We do a lot of investigations. So our office enforces several labor laws with regards to agriculture and non-agriculture. And yes, there's been a lot of information out there, I think in recent years, that we've conducted a number of investigations. Whether you've been investigated before as a grower or haven't, or you may never be investigated, I want to give you information that you can utilize and be able to progress in the future to make sure that you're in compliance with laws, that you know what you need to do in order to be prepared to pay people appropriately, and that you can feel secure that you're doing what you should be doing. So there's a lot of information, really. We're not going to get through it. This is kind of just an introductory course. The goal here is to give you the information, and you've got resources. I've given you a lot of handouts, and there's some other publications in the back, so that you can go back to that if you have any questions. And feel free to give me a call. You don't have to say who you are, but if you have any questions regarding certain things, certain aspects of your business, and you're not sure how to move forward in paying people, feel free to give me a call. But anyways, the Department of Labor. So let me make sure I'm going to do this. Can you take off the sound? Is there a way to? Oh, terrible. So there's actually 4 major laws that the Department of Labor enforces with regards to labor aspects. The first is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's actually a very wide-ranging law that really applies to almost all businesses in the U.S. And it covers minimum wage, federal minimum wage, not state, overtime, record keeping, and the employment of minors. The second one is the Migrant Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. So they're 2 separate laws, and that covers labor protections for workers. It requires the registration of farm labor contractors federally, and some other items. And so what I really want to do is really focus in on the Fair Labor Standards Act. If we have a little bit of time, I'll get into the MISPA. I'll be calling it Migrant Seasonal Agriculture Worker Protection Act MISPA, because I just don't think we're going to have enough time, but it'll hopefully give you an idea of what you need to do. Those are awesome sounds. So the federal minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act is $7.25 an hour. It's not $9.10, that's state minimum wage. It's not the higher rates that you find in California, Washington, and Oregon. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. That's what we enforce under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Overtime, there's an overtime requirement under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it's almost always time and a half after 40 hours a week. There will be exceptions, and I'll go into that in a little bit, with regards to agriculture. But in general, all employers who are subject to Fair Labor Standards Act have to pay their employees, their non-exempt employees, time and a half after 40. There are child labor provisions. Essentially, anyone under the age of 18 is a minor. And in agriculture, there's certain specifications as to what minors can do and not do. And under non-agricultural establishments, it's under 18. So there's a little bit, the age kind of gets a little bit higher with regards to how to have those occupations in non-agriculture. And then there's record-keeping requirements. The need to maintain records of hours and payrolls that we'll get into. I'm not going to get into this too much. It's just that some employers may not be covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act, so you need to know if you would be covered or not. In general, if your firm grosses, not net, we know, net's a little bit different, but grosses at least $500,000 a year, and you have 2 or more employees, you're going to be covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Lots of people don't hit that, and lots of people in agriculture don't. But your employees may be individually covered, and your employees may be individually covered if they are producing or manufacturing or harvesting goods that are eventually going to move across state lines, or they're assisting in that movement. So usually in agriculture, almost all field workers are covered, unless you're just selling your product to your neighbor and they're going to eat it there. So that's one thing. A lot of people think, oh, well, we don't hit 500,000, so we're not covered. Your employees may very well be covered, and so that means you would be subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And if I'm moving too fast or if it gets confusing, let me know, please. So the $7.25 an hour, obviously we think about hourly rates. You should be paying at least $7.25 an hour if you're subject to the act. But a lot of people pay, and it's okay. You can pay your workers salary, piece rate, contract rate, commissions, bonuses, day rate, anything you see. But the fact of the matter is, if you're subject to the act and your employees are non-exempt, you still have to pay them $7.25 an hour. And that means that if you're paying them other than hourly rate, you're always going to have to take meticulous records of hours that they work in order to determine whether you're paying them $7.25. But if in a harvest season you're paying folks piece rate, you're going to have to ensure that you're maintaining meticulous records of hours, stop and start time, to ensure at the end of the week you're paying them at least minimum wage, dividing those hours into that total remuneration equals whatever that regular rate is. So here's an example. Someone collects 300 boxes a week. They're paid $1 a box. It ends up being 50 hours that week that they worked. You divide that 50 hours into the $300. They're only being paid $6 an hour, so you have to boost it up to $7.25. Most of your people are probably making well above that, but sometimes it falls under, and so that's where you're going to have that boost. And that is for each individual working. So sometimes there are situations where there's multiple people working together. You're going to have to be vigilant and ensure that you've got records on each individual, that each is being paid in order to determine what they're making. Overtime. The law requires overtime after 40 hours in a week. Now there's an exception to people working in agriculture. So you don't have to pay overtime. Construction does, restaurants do, but if you're working in agriculture, you don't have to pay those folks overtime. There are some exceptions. There are some items that you have to bear in mind, though, where overtime would come into play. So if you have a retail operation at your farm, not on your farm, but say a nursery, for example, and it's in town, you also have a nursery establishment at your farm. The nursery in town, the retail store, they may very well not be, you may have to pay overtime because it's not farm work, right? Another example is reforestation, folks that work in the mountains, doing pre-commercial thinning or firefighting. Actually, this is incorrect, the Christmas tree. That's changed. So, but the reforestation is you're subject to overtime. The folks have to be paid overtime. Wineries, how many, a lot of wineries have their vineyards, and people pick and harvest on the vineyards, and then they may go into the winery to bottle. That winery itself is not, it's not agriculture. So, so they're packing and processing sheds. If you have a packing or processing shed on your property and you're packing and processing only your product, you're good. You don't have to pay overtime. Once, though, you start handling your neighbor's goods and those workers are handling those goods too, that exemption is out the window. So it taints that week, so you have to pay overtime. So there's certain things that you have to be very cognizant of because it could, trip your operation up with regards to overtime. Does anyone have any questions on any of that?
Yes.
Yes.
How vigilant do you have to be when you hire somebody and you have to guarantee the minimum wage? Do you wait till the end of the day to calculate that, or the end of the week to calculate that? When does that have to be calculated?
Well, usually, I would wait till the end of the week because that's where you're going to get the full remuneration. That's where you're going to find out how much they were ultimately paid. You can divide the hours into that and find out what the rate is.
But if you have a guy that's picking piecework, he only works one day.
Then yeah, you've got to.
You got to calculate.
You got to kind of, yeah. The Christmas trees, that I should take that out. That's been changed. If it's a Christmas tree operation, you don't have to pay overtime. Obviously, deductions. If there's any deductions that are non-statutory, if it's bringing that worker below minimum wage, I'm not talking about insurance benefits. I'm not talking about taxes, but anything else that's bringing that worker below $7.25 an hour, then you're probably not making appropriate deductions if it's especially for the employer's benefit. If the, I'll give you some examples here. Oftentimes, employers will require people to bring their own, pruning shears or purchase their own, bring their own equipment. Those are really tools for the benefit of the employer. And so those items, those charges cannot be taken that would reduce that employee's earnings below minimum wage. Damages to employer's property. I know, someone wrecked my vehicle. I want to take their check out too. But you're going to have to find out a way to recoup that, whether you take them to small claims. Federal law allows you to reduce wages to federal minimum wage, but not below. So that's something that you're going to have to, if that ever happens, and hopefully not. Hopefully it doesn't, but it does happen, and we get those calls from time to time. Okay, so there are, even though you're covered and you're subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's probably going to be a number of you that may fall under an exemption, meaning that you don't have to pay according to minimum wage, overtime, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want, there's a number of items here. If your firm, if you have relatively few employees, and you employ fewer than 500 man days per quarter in the previous calendar year, then you can be exempt from all of that. What is 500 man days? A man day is 1 day of work by an individual, and that one day of work can be as little as 1 hour. So if Jose works for you 3 days for 1 hour, he's worked 3 man days. So if you have an operation that's primarily machine harvest, and you have a couple of seasonal employees and maybe bring on a couple more during harvest season in that one quarter, you probably are not hitting that 500 man day. You could be exempt. However, if you hire a farm labor contractor during that time to bring in his crew of 300 for several weeks, then you're probably not going to be exempt because that's part of the man-day count as well. So does that make sense?
Are you sure of that? Because I thought contract labor didn't count under 500 mandates.
It does. Direct family members are exempt. This is another one. Local hand harvest workers paid piece rates who worked fewer than 13 weeks during the last year. Then if all of these folks worked fewer than 13 weeks last year, you could be exempt as well. That's local hand harvest workers. It's people who live locally. The 13 weeks can be at any other farm. It doesn't have to be at your farm. It can be at 13 farms. And it could be in 1 week that person worked 1 day at Farmer John's. And so, that could possibly be a situation here with a lot of people who, don't work during the summer. But one thing that you really want to do is you're going to have to make meticulous records of proof of this. What they have to do is provide you a signed sheet, a signed paper stating that they only worked 13 weeks last year. And I didn't, one thing before I keep going with this, but there's a record-keeping publication on the back table. I didn't want to inundate you with too many items, but if you care to pick it up, it's back there, and it will specify under agricultural operations what you need to do to prove, or for the records that you need to maintain for these exemptions. Okay. There's also if you have range workers who are sheep herders, for example, that's an exemption, and also minors under the age of 16 who are paid piece rate and work with their parents on the same property, and they're paid the same piece rate, then those folks can be exempt as well. And so in the packet that I provided, you can get more information on this. There's some online documents that you can pull up that fully explains this. So you may find in your particular operation that the exemption may apply. You just need to make sure you're maintaining accurate records as proof. Again, agriculture workers, that includes farm office personnel. If you're working at the farm in the office, they're also exempt from overtime. Record keeping, like any business, you need to make sure that you're maintaining contact information for that employee, their full name, date of birth, if they're under the age of 19, their rate of pay, gross wages, net wages, deductions, hours per week, date of, like they just say date of birth. It's vital that you do that because that's the only way that you can ensure that you're paying every single person out on your property correctly, especially with regards to the piece rate harvest folks, where sometimes there would be so many people out on the fields that possibly, and it's hard to track if people are working in groups. You need to ensure that each person's, that they're being paid appropriately, and the only way you can do that is maintaining those records. This is just some references where you can get some additional publication information. I brought most of it except the Part 780, CFR Part 780, and that explains in detail all the exemptions. Okay, minors. Minors, it is part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. There is a parental exemption for kids of the growers. So anyone over the 16 and over can basically do anything on the farm or on the ranch. Under 16, it's a little bit different. Someone under the age of 14 or 15 may work outside school hours, doing most types of jobs, but there are restrictions on certain types of jobs that they can do, on hazardous jobs. I'll get into that a little bit. 12 or 13-year-old folks, they can work, they can do some work outside of school hours, as long as they're working with their parents or have permission from their parents. So sometimes we see, you know, those miners working out in a field and, you know, the parents are there isn't a permission slip, and that's a problem. Anyone under the age of 12, they can't work unless that firm is expressly exempt or not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. We talked about that regarding the 500-man days. If you're not meeting that, then they can do, we wouldn't have an issue with the hand harvest. So, let me skip over this because we don't really see that. So, I'm going to skip over a lot of this. I mean, there's a lot of occupations that miners can't do. There's the obvious ones like running a swather, running larger tractors, getting into a pen with a small pen with a stud horse or a boar. Although in open field, it's not a problem. And sometimes they can do it as long as they've received certificates from 4-H training on that. So I have printed out some documents that you guys can go through that to make sure that you're okay. But for purposes of time, I'm going to skip over it. So the main thing under the Fair Labor Standards Act, make sure that the supervisors out in the field are well trained, that they know what the laws are. Sometimes things can bypass them. They don't know anything about the miners, youth employment, and sometimes that's what gets to be a problem because a lot of the folks out there who are working sometimes are minors and the supervisor just didn't catch it or he didn't know. Or they didn't know that they're supposed to maintain accurate records of hours at the time that people start working until the time they leave, and everything's just, you know, scheduled hours. Make sure that all your personnel out on the field are fully trained on these matters, because sometimes you guys are really busy and you're not going to be out there 24/7. You're depending on other folks to handle that, and just make sure that they understand what they need to do so that you don't have issues. And likewise, if you end up hiring a farm labor contractor to do the work, and you say, oh, that's good, you know, I'm free. I don't have to deal with that stuff. I just have to deal with. There's a very good chance that you could be equally responsible for those workers of that farm labor contractor if they're not doing things right. There's a very good chance. And it's not necessarily a black and white decision on, well, yes, these folks fall under your purview or they don't. There's a lot of items that you have to look at with regards to the economic reality of the situation, and if you're making any decisions regarding those folks, you have any control over the situation, albeit minor, you could be definitely responsible if that farm labor contractor didn't do his job and pay the people appropriately, or he didn't check on the miners' dates of birth. So I want to point that out. There's some additional information that I have provided on that as well that I would take a look at. These are additional fact sheets. Okay. So, and by the way, the Fair Labor Standards Act is the act that provides that if you were employing folks in violation, if you were illegally employing minors, and you were not paying people in accordance with minimum wage and overtime, that the hot goods could be invoked. So I wanted to pay particular attention to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Main thing, make sure, and I can't stress this enough, make sure that you maintain accurate records of hours on each individual, that you're ensuring that those records reflect the hours and the pay so that you can determine whether they're making minimum wage or not, and boost that up if you need to. And then make sure that you are not employing minors unlawfully. And if you feel really confident that you're doing that, then you should be good. And you should, and it is a lot of work, but if you feel confident that you're meeting those requirements, then you can be pretty confident, I think, that you're employing people correctly and paying them correctly. Now, the MISPA is a little bit different. MISPA is a whole other law, but it also applies to farmers, farm labor contractors, and associations. It provides for the registration of farm labor contractors, the proper disclosure to migrant and seasonal farm workers, record-keeping requirements, which are very similar to the Fair Labor Standards Act requirements, wage requirements, and then if you transport, or if your farm labor contractor transports or houses people, there's a lot to that as well. Lots of safety requirements. Again, MISPA applies to growers, farm labor contractors, associations, and if they, for a fee, furnish, recruit, employ, solicit, hire, transport folks. That's a lot, but it covers most of the workers on the site. So a migrant, and it applies to migrant and seasonal farm workers. And I believe the definitions are a little bit different than what the state has regarding migrant and seasonal, okay? Migrant is if a person is not returning to their permanent home every day to sleep. Seasonal is they're not required to stay overnight. And I think a lot of employers think, well, I have my, Bill he works for me all year long, he's permanent, so he doesn't apply. But the federal definitions incorporate that, unless you're a supervisor, or unless you're not mainly doing field type of work, then you're going to be classified as seasonal. So that could be a little bit different than the states. So, so bear that in mind. Again, joint employment, I'm going to skip over that because I discussed that a little bit. You could be jointly responsible for your farm labor contractors, workers. So your farm labor contractor, if you hire a farm labor contractor, he or she has to be federally registered. And the state also requires registration as well. And so when I was an investigator, what I encountered frequently was that farm labor contractors would have their state registrations, but they didn't have their federal ones. Well, to us, it's you don't have one. So they need to get one, and they need to provide you with that evidence. They have to carry those little cards on them, and they have it's a little card. What color is it? Green or orange? Yeah, but and it reflects a number. It reflects who they are, and when their registration expires. So they need to provide that to you. You need to demand that from them. And usually on this side of the area, they have to apply through our San Francisco office. So it does take a little time to go through that process, but they have to do that. So typically, they would provide you with evidence of federal and evidence of state. We would enforce the federal. In addition, the farm labor contractor, if he or she has workers who do those recruiting activities, furnish, recruit, employ, transfer, et cetera, transport, workers, they have to be registered as well as an employee for the farm labor contractor, as an FLCE. And they have to carry a card with them. So oftentimes, what we would see, sometimes we would see one of the workers transporting the workers in a van or whatnot to the job sites, and he was never registered. Sometimes he didn't even have a driver's license, which is another thing. So, so they need to, and I don't think the state has that requirement. So that's something that, if you come across that, or with your farm labor contractor, you see someone else driving, I would probably check to see if he's, got that. It's just word to apply. So at the time of recruitment or the time of hire, whichever is the earliest, you have to disclose a number of items to those workers. For example, what you're going to pay them, what crop they're going to be working in, what they're going to be doing, if you're going to be making any deductions, et cetera, And I've actually, in this packet somewhere towards the back, I've provided some non-required samples of this disclosure. One's in English and one's in Spanish. And this lists all of the items that you have to list. And I'm going to tell you that it is a little bit different than the states. This has some more items than the state disclosure. So if you're only using the states, then there's going to be a disclosure problem. So you just need to devise some kind of a form that incorporates, I think, all the questions for you to be okay. But there's one in English and one in Spanish, and you have to provide it to the worker in their language. So the migrant worker, you would provide it, you would give them a copy. The seasonal, you just have to tell them verbally. However, if they want a copy, you give them a copy. And yeah, there's a lot of items. You're going to be listing the rate of pay. If it's going to be piece rate, you put down the piece rate. And then you ensure that you pay them that. But then what you also do is ensure that they're meeting, does anyone know what rate? Minimum wage? Minimum wage. Pardon me?
In federal or state?
There you go. Yeah. First federal, but then there's also a provision in MISPA that you have to comply with state laws. So not only the piece rate, but the federal and the state.
So for Oregon, 725 is irrelevant because Oregon.
And I will get into the exemptions in a little bit, but if you're covered and non-exempt under MISPA, then you're going to have to pay the state minimum wage and the piece rate. So the piece rate, if it's coming down lower than state minimum wage, you're going to have to boost it up. And that's not the Fair Labor Standards Act, that is MISPA. So yeah, rates of pay, period of employment, place of employment, what crop they're working in. Workers' comp insurance, you have to list that. If there's any transportation arrangements or housing conditions, sometimes what we would see is that, people would be transported to and fro, and the farm labor contractor or the, farmer said, we need to recoup these costs. There's a lot of you, and it's wearing down our vehicles, so we're going to charge you whatever amount, which may have been a reasonable amount. It's not costing, you're not making a profit out of it. But because you didn't disclose it, guess what? You have to pay it back. So that's one thing you want to watch out for.
On that transportation, as far as if they're going to a different site, the pay starts when they have to report to get on the bus, or when they have to, because they had some issues in California with that, where they were transported to a different site. Or does it have to be where the employee can choose whether they can take that transportation?
Okay, so are you talking about transportation? Okay, so they work in one field and they go to another field?
Or say they, an employer arranged bus service to where they can all show up and get bus to the field. When does the do they get paid when they get the field, or they have to get paid when they get to the bus?
So it depends on a couple of things. Usually, if it's for the benefit of the worker, they're offering rate arrangements to get to the bus, and they're just hauling them there. And the driver for sure has to be paid for that transportation time to the site, but the workers do not necessarily. If the workers have to go to that designated area first and load up the truck with the essential tools and everything else, their day starts there, and then the transportation needs to be paid. If they get to the job site and they're working one field and then they're transported to another field, it takes another 30 minutes during the course of the day, that transportation is considered work time.
So basically, if the employee has a choice to opt out of that, so they can go straight to the job, or they have the benefit of transportation, then that allows for
Right.
that. If
Right.
you force them to take the bus, then you have to pay for that.
Well, how would you?
Yeah, I think a really good one is, and I think we've talked about this,
Mhm.
where the employer doesn't want 100 cars out there. So he'd rather put them on a bus and take them to work. That's different than, like what you said earlier about giving somebody the option. So in that case, they would have to pay for that. Because they don't want 100 cars out there, so they're controlling the situation, and they really just want everybody at the same time on the bus. They don't want to take any risks of anybody not showing up, so time to start there. But there's a lot of different factors. You know, sometimes I answer the public line on the phone, and I hate giving answers. And I know you as an employee or an employer, you want quick answers, but there really sometimes isn't really a quick answer. And so sometimes I answer the public line, and I hate to give an answer because there's so many exemptions, there's so many situations. I'll give you an example. I'm one of the managers, by the way, at the Portland District Office. I handle our field office in Idaho, and there's an Idaho State Department, and sometimes employers will call them, and over there they do give information like, yeah, you're exempt. And then we get calls and we're like, who told you that? Well, you know, you got information over the phone. You really got to do an investigation, interview, talk to, really get all the facts to find out what's going on and make a determination. That's really the key. But just to give you some, you know, somewhat general guidelines here, what Karen said earlier about the employer's benefit, that's always kind of a key buzzword, employer benefit.
Any other questions on that? Yeah.
Just a clarification, I mean, if it's that difficult for you to interpret it, you know that the employer's got to be in a real tough spot trying to interpret that too.
Well, there's a lot,
But it's
yeah.
just, the term employer benefit means if you're requiring something that benefits the employer, that's the time, that's on the clock.
Yeah, he gave a good example, and there's a lot of times, I've seen it like in berry harvest, like a grape harvest, where, look, I understand if I were a grower, I wouldn't want 50 million cars around the perimeter, or, you know, if you have wine grapes, you know, getting on the property, that'd just be a disaster. So they would require, or ask the FLC, the farm labor contractor, hey, will you just, you know, try and get everyone here in a couple of buses or whatever. And so they're it's established that way, and at that point, if people are required to be at a certain point and then they carpool them up, then that is oftentimes compensable. But there's often times where, you know, I would do an investigation and some people would carpool, the employer said, hey, however you get here, you get here. You know, and they got there, and that's not, that time isn't, whether they decide to go in the office first and hitch a ride and contribute to the gas, it wasn't a requirement. So there's a lot of things with travel time, both in agriculture and non-agriculture, that it depends on each scenario. So yeah, if you have further questions, I didn't bring that pub, but I can bring that for you guys, that information, because I think it would come up quite a bit. Wage statements, typical pay stubs, name of the employer, their address. This is a big one that a lot of employers don't do, and it's only a requirement in agriculture, is putting your federal ID number on those pay stubs. So if you don't have those on the pay stubs, you need to put them on. So again, pay the rate disclosed, promised, or contracted. Don't pay less than minimum wage. State minimum wage. Have to pay at least semi-monthly. Do your taxes. It's just deductions. I'd already mentioned this. You need to disclose the deductions other than your taxes and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into this too much. Transportation. Do any of you provide transportation for workers or hire a farm labor contractor to do that? Okay, you don't have to raise it. Okay. The main thing is that if you do, you have to really make sure that that vehicle is fully functional, functionable, the brakes are working, the lights are working. We've seen some pretty bad ones. You guys have heard about some nasty accidents that cause people to lose their lives. So it's really imperative that these vehicles are not only safe but properly insured. The insurance is $100,000 per seat. So there's a lot of things that you have to insure on that. I've got some information. I'm not going to delve into it too much.
Yeah. Check with our farm labor contractor and check his van too. Are we responsible if something happens to them? Is it gonna roll downhill?
Well, here's the thing with transportation. If you control any aspect of that transportation, then it could. So, for example, if you're telling the farm labor contractor, hey, I want you to bring everyone in 2 vans, then you're starting to meddle in the transportation issue. So it really depends.
Okay, we didn't tell them anything. They just come out with the van. But then, like you said, we noticed one driver brings them in, and then when they run down to the store, we see another guy driving. So we're supposed to watch that too.
Well, I would probably call them on it. You know, just now that you know. Look, they're supposed to be giving you evidence that they have license. I would ask for their employees, their copy cards as well. And they also have to provide evidence to our San Francisco office of each vehicle that they're using, like the VIN number, you know, the driver's license, or the plate number, all that. So there's a whole list of things that they have to provide that's already in there. So they should be able to provide that to you, you know, as evidence. But you could certainly call us and we could look it up on our database if you so inclined. But
it's kind of starting to make me nervous on how much we have to control. I mean, when they leave the field to go for a break and they're hauling ass because they got 15 minutes and there's 20 of them that have to get through that store to get their goodie, and the vans are rocking as it's going out of the field. It's like,
yeah. You know, if you're starting to control any of it, then you need to watch it. Do you have anything to add on that?
No, other than, you know, like in California, one year we had, I think, almost 10 vehicles that someone died in a vehicle, and it was either for bald tires, seat belts, driving reckless, all kinds of stuff. And so we take it really serious. And if you're the employer or the grower, you've got a lot of leverage here. You want to work for me, you better get your stuff in order. And yeah, it wouldn't hurt to check things out, no.
But that doesn't mean you're controlling it.
Right.
It's just you're being vigilant.
Yeah.
But if we're held liable, you better control it. In fact, if we're held liable for something that they didn't do correctly, we better control it.
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
you've got to look at it both ways. You know, we may not have ultimate responsibility and liability.
Yeah.
But even if it's that little bit,
Yeah.
is it worth losing your farm?
That would be my question.
You
You're right.
know?
Yeah.
You know, do you care about your employees? Do you care about the people that put food on the table for everybody else that work with you? Do you care about them? And if you do, then you might go that extra mile and check things out. And that's really the bottom line.
I would counter there, so if they're showing up in their private vehicles, does that mean we gotta monitor their private vehicles when they show up in our? But you're saying,
No.
go the extra mile to make sure that they're safe, but if they drive out to work, now we look at their car, maybe it's got bald tires, and you just said.
No.
Okay.
I think you're confusing both. The whole regulation regarding transportation is, it's not your own vehicle. That's your responsibility. We're talking about where you're pulling workers, like you said earlier, pulling them to other job sites or to the store, that kind of thing, where you're transporting the workers. That's where the regulations kick in. They don't kick in for you showing up to work and you got bald tires.
If it's a
you're
bona
not
fide,
liable for that.
if it's a bona fide carpooling situation or workers bringing their own vehicles, yeah. Unless the farm labor contractor is directing people, hey, go with Jose, you know, he'll take you. We want you to go with Jose, because he doesn't want to pay $100,000 liability on each seat. Then it could be a little bit different for him, okay? But not every case reflects that the farm labor contractor's transportation problems are that of the growers as well. It just depends on how much or if that grower is controlling anything with regards to the transportation. And, you know, and that's where you're gonna have to take an honest look at your operation. You know, I mean, if I had a farm or a ranch, I'd probably wanna be scrutinizing everything. I mean, you're heavily invested with your properties, and you're heavily invested with everything that's going on. So I would wanna make sure that everything's going right, but yeah, then that puts me into, you know, a situation where I may be controlling a little bit. Depends.
So you're saying that even though I scrutinize my contractor's vehicle as he drives in the field and tell him that he's got to go get this fixed and that fixed and that fixed before he can work for me, I'm not controlling his business?
Oh, well, yeah, that would be, there'd be some control in that. I mean, yeah, it's, I mean,
You know, and then if we require them to fix that, who's gonna pay? Who's gonna pay for that to be fixed? Well, if you want me to work for you, then you pay for the, you know,
Yeah.
you pay for the,
well, you know,
For the upgrade.
you're the one who controls who you want to contract, and if you've got these folks, you know, who are just not doing their job, you know, at that point, you know, you can just let them know that you're looking for someone else. I mean, I know it's not that easy, but they know better. They shouldn't be bringing those kind of vehicles onto your property.
I think that kind of thing has to be written into your contract with your contractor. You can't come without providing this equipment.
If you do that, if you,
You
piece of
can't
paper say
control
the
it.
responsibility for worker safety, transportation safety is that if you both sign that agreement, would that satisfy your organization? Would that keep the farmer safe? If he went through the diligence of having that contractor sign a document?
Well, if the reality is you were in control of you had control in that situation, and there was an accident out there, then the reality is even if you had it in the contract, you probably have some
Well, I
problems.
mean, to and from the field, you know, we're all talking about that gray area where they're busing to the field. Once the transportation involves the farm activity, like you say, from field to field or anything like that, I can see where, all right, we've got some responsibility there, but, you know, there's obviously a gray area where pulling them and bringing them and, you know, in any sort of a lawsuit, it's, well, this is out the window because you get sued regardless, but we just want to know what if a contract like that would satisfy your organization for that initial transport.
I don't know if it would satisfy our organization,
So,
to be honest.
It's like what Karen said, it's what really happens out in the field is really what counts. But I like your idea of putting, you know, I mean, you've got 5 people that want to work for you as FLCs. Which one are you going to go with? Are you going to go with the one that you've got an agreement with and agrees to comply, and if they don't with all this stuff, then they get fired? Or, you know what I mean? So you could put that in the contract, and that can be the agreement. But the Department of Labor will hold you responsible for that, employer responsible for this, regardless of the agreement.
Manny?
Just a quick, I think the original question is the liability. Ultimately, the angler who hires the farm labor contractor, I mean, as an investigator, you're going to be looked at no matter what. So ultimately, sure, you can be held responsible for anything that the farm labor contractor does, ultimately. The end result is what Karen is saying, how much protection. You can't bury your hand in the sand and say, I knew nothing at that time. So that's what the investigators go out and do is, are you doing what to be in compliance? So, or the answer is sure, you can be ultimately, because anybody can sue anybody for any reason. And the Department of Labor is going to be out there to make sure when they're doing their interviews that you did not have any part of that. I mean, that's critical, especially when you're dealing with vehicles that are transporting the workers. So ultimately, sure, everybody who hires a farm labor contractor should be responsible for everything that their contractor does.
I mean, part of that process, when we do our investigations, is precisely that, is we find out what do workers say, what does the FLC say? And if they say, oh, yeah, the grower, you didn't ask me to do anything, I just, this is how I made my arrangements with my workers, and the workers say, oh yeah, I haven't talked to the grower, and the FLC Jose said we had to get in this, junky van and sit on the floors without the seats, and, there really isn't the connection to the grower. But maybe on another case there would be. So it's whatever the reality is for that situation, yes.
So if you're no labor contractor and your workers come to work in their own vehicles, drive to the field, maybe from field to field, if it's during the workday, they're on pay, but is there any liability there for those vehicles?
That's their own vehicles, and you're not controlling it. You just hired them and said, this is where the work time starts, this is where it's going to be, this is where it ends. And you're right, between the two fields, you're going to be paying that time for work time, the travel time. But yeah, that's a different situation.
We're not required to steal license or see proof of insurance or?
No, he's not from there.
But they are liable if they're on the clock and they're working for your business. If they get in an accident, you're liable.
Yeah,
So
probably.
you're not going to be in a problem.
We're talking about a lot of. There's a
But you're
lot
going
of
to have
laws,
an
yeah.
issue with liability because if they're on the clock, they're on your time. So they're going to go against the guy that's got money, which is usually the employer.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? And there's just different standards. DOL standards apply to cars and vans where there's less than 75-mile transportation. DOT standards apply to all other vehicles. Licensed driver with farm labor contractors, there's been so many times that, I wouldn't say, over 10 times, but just a lot of those drivers do not have licenses, or they can't provide me evidence of that, and that's, it happens, they need it.
What's the doctor's certificate here?
That is for that's for DOT. The doctor's certificate is
For the
for the
CDL?
farm labor contractor who has someone who is driving, transporting folks. They have to provide evidence that they can do it, that they're healthy, that they have their
That's an
vision.
any size vehicle or a CDL required?
That's just any size.
So a four-door pickup,
If they're transporting folks, they
Okay.
need to provide a
doctor's
doctor's
certificate.
stuff, yeah. To our San Francisco office when they're registered.
The CDL requirement, would that be with a van, or is there a certain number? Is that?
I think it's a certain weight of the
It
vehicle.
is a certain weight. What is the weight? Over 10, is it over 10,000? Oh, that's right, yeah. Yeah.
So it's not number of passengers, it's size of the vehicle?
There's also a passenger
And I can get you guys that information. I don't have it in, I don't know what it is exactly, but I can get that to you. Just more insurance requirements for vehicles if you're transporting migrant or seasonal farm workers, 100,000 per seat, or workers' comp with 50,000 property damage. And if you're transporting people across you need to be cognizant, if you have property in Washington or in Idaho and you transport them across state lines, you're gonna have to see whether that coverage applies, because it may not.
Yeah, it's slightly, I can't, off the top of my head, it is different though. I've had situations where somebody's in compliance in Oregon, and then oops, they go do work over there, and all of a sudden they're not in compliance with Washington.
This is just, a lot of people carpool, and that's fine, save gas. Sometimes though, like I said before, the farm labor contractor will have people intentionally carpool so that he doesn't have to transport people, and so sometimes those situations are not bona fide. Just some examples of improper transportation. Housing, if anyone houses, does anyone house Does anyone want information on housing at this point? We'll skip over that. I've got some information that I've passed out, but if you are controlling housing or operating housing, you need to make sure that you're doing everything possible to make sure that that housing's safe.
I would like to have a copy of that.
Okay, okay, we'll do. Okay, exemptions to MISPA. Again, it's the 500 man-day test. So if you don't apply, if it doesn't apply to you like under the FLSA, you may be exempt under this as well. Okay, so that you wouldn't be required to do all that's required under MISPA. The other one is the family business exemption. Say you do well over 500 man days in that quarter. But if you are, or you or your immediate family member are the only ones who are directly furnishing, recruiting, employing, hiring, transporting those workers, then you can be exempt under the family business exemption. So what I will say to you on this is that sometimes people really rely on another supervisor, another individual who speaks really good Spanish to, you know, talk to the folks, communicate, translate. That doesn't mean that that person is doing those activities for you. But if you're relying on that person, because sometimes it gets comfortable and you start relying on Jose to, hey, you know, we call the crew and get him back here and we need him here by such and such time. And, you know, and he starts making the rounds to get people. What's he doing? He's recruiting those people for you. So therefore that family business exemption is out the window. So be sure that if you have that supervisor communicating with the folks and translating, that's just what he's doing. You know, he's supervising the folks, he's, you know, translating, giving them information, but you're not using him to do the other stuff. For farm labor contractors, as long as they're, you know, working less than 13 weeks and not driving, recruiting beyond a 25-mile contracting, engaging in contracting activities beyond a 25-mile radius, they can be exempt. Don't see too many of those. There's other exemptions, such as custom poultry outfits, custom combine outfits where they do haying services for other folks. And that's about it. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah.
Could you go over the seasonal, what classifies as seasonal again? Just the definition. Seasonal worker is, seasonal worker would be one, they could, who goes back to their house to sleep overnight. They don't, you know, they're not living in temporary housing, they're, you know, they go back to their permanent resident each night to sleep, so they're pretty local. And, you know, in terms of comparing them to a permanent worker, they would be folks who do, you know, your field activities or the processing shed activities. But if that person works full-time and say they're a supervisor or foreman or do primarily activities that are not field work, then they wouldn't necessarily be determined to be a seasonal worker. Does that make sense?
What about length of time? So they could be employed 12 months.
52 weeks out of the year, but if they're doing field work all the time, you know, then, you know, the regulations specify, they give an example of seasonal employee, but also what is seasonal work. And so if that's what they're doing, then we wouldn't necessarily determine them to be a permanent employee or a non-seasonal worker. So it's a little bit different than I think, Boley's requirements.
I heard recently that Mr. Obama was planning on increasing the minimum wage to $10. Have you heard anything? Is that any truth in that? Or?
Karen, let me repeat questions so
Okay.
people can hear them. And I believe the question was, you heard that the minimum wage, Obama was proposing a $10 minimum wage. And we're just wondering if
You've heard anything about it, or is it true, or what do you
There's
think?
a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of info out there, huh? Do you have anything that you would contribute on that?
No.
There's nothing, it's a lot of,
We don't have anything official coming yet. So we'd rather not say yet.
We don't know what to say.
Washington's being Washington.
So that was political talk.
Karen, I've got a question,
Yeah.
and that is, this is great, but what I was wondering if you could address a little bit the rules that your agency has when they're interacting with growers or workers. Are there certain guidelines that you guys are operating by that growers should be aware of?
Well, generally, what I can tell you is that we have the authority to look at employers' records, regardless of whether you're a construction restaurant or a grower or a farm labor contractor. Our authority is to look at records. And so one of the first things that, if you ever get investigated by an investigator, or a team of investigators, one of the first things they'll advise you of is, we need to look at your records, your time records, and your payroll records. And your time records, you should be maintaining those. You're required to maintain those for 2 years. Your payroll for 3 years. If you've got a farm labor contractor, which I didn't cover here, if you've got a farm labor contractor, they need to be giving you copies of his records of those workers on your site, and you need to maintain those as well. And so, if you don't have any records, that poses a bit of a problem. Or if you don't have records on some people, that's a bit of a problem. If you don't have any time records, it creates problems because the investigators will really need to interview a lot of folks to find out what time you came in, what time you left, and that type of thing. And so I don't know if that's really what you wanted. I can tell you that we would request those records. We would look. The investigator may not look at all those records, but
I guess where I'm getting to is there's a fair amount of confusion and discussion about when somebody from the agency shows up at the farm, is how to respond to that, or what are the rules and rights on both sides of that issue. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to clarify the issue from their point of view is how should they respond when somebody does show up at their farm?
With the no trespassing sign posted at the end.
Yes,
but it's an open field.
Do you have to give prior notice to request an audit or investigate? Or can it be a surprise?
Well, most of the times we'll just show up, and we will often do that at non-agricultural non-ag sites too. You guys aren't the only ones. I don't know how to respond to that because, when I was an investigator, most people were pretty, they weren't happy to see me, but but they were, they're fine. At the end of the day, people just want me out of their hair, so.
Karen, how about just describing how maybe you would conduct your investigation based on, I was an investigator for over 10 years, a long time ago, but how I conducted the investigation, I went over the same things with everybody I spoke with, but how you behave caused me to behave a certain way. You do this, I'm going to go this way. Being forthright, providing the information, here's what I've got, being open and honest, is going to send the investigation in a certain way. Hiding stuff, you tell me one thing, and then 10 minutes later, I'm going to find out that what you told me is actually not true. The antenna is going to go up, and I'm going to be looking at every page that you have. So how you behave is going to cause, to a certain extent, how the investigation is going to go.
Well, I would say this, is that, if I'm asking for the records and the payroll, and you can provide that to me, obviously, we're going to do some sampling of interviews out on the field, or maybe the office. Just straightforward. They're pretty straightforward questions regarding how are you paid, when did you begin working here, what's your, how long have you worked here, that type of thing. Who's your boss? Who hired you? He says John the farmer, then, you might be responsible. So you know, so we gather that information, and usually, you know, if you're doing everything that you are, if your records are reflecting, you know, Jose's hours, and I can look in the payroll, and it's right there, and then I talk to Jose, and everything lines up, we're gonna be out of there pretty quickly.
Are you showing up because of a complaint, or are you showing up just randomly to see how we're doing today?
We get both. But we're not gonna say the reasons why we're there, but we get both. And it doesn't mean that they're substantiated, you know, you get complaints and they're unsubstantiated, but we gotta do it.
Can everybody hear the questions?
Yes.
What you've asked here on all these paperwork and this entire thing is very, very extensive for record keeping. And it's very costly to me. And my question here is there any problem with me deducting the total cost of what you're asking me to do here from my taxes? Is it deductible?
Ask your accountant. I haven't done my taxes yet.
The other thing that's important with your record keeping, we found that when they interview the worker, oh, I don't remember having a break. And you give them a break every day, and they're gonna say, oh, did you have a break? Oh, maybe that one day I did.
Maybe that's what that was.
Yeah, and so
I kinda
having
feel like
it
that's
documented is very important because they're gonna sign and say they actually had a break, but they don't remember, and some of them feel very pressured because they're not used to that environment. That's what we found with some of the workers, is they feel very pressured, and so they wanna kind of appease you guys too, and so they say, oh, what do I need to say to get done? You know, oh, I'll say that, you know, so that, you know, some of that you may see too, is that they,
And then we get the opposite sometimes. So, you know.
But the normal reaction of a grower or a worker is gonna be a fight or flight syndrome.
You're right.
You know, regardless of who you are, and as well controlled as you might be, that's gonna be your initial first reaction.
You know, and I when I was an investigator, I got that too. You know, I understood it, you know.
Because we're all gonna come from the defensive point of view.
Right.
Until you do something to help us drop back a little bit, you know? So in that response, it's kind of like, so when you guys come onto a farm, into a business, do you find the person in charge first, or do you just walk out in the field and pick the employee out there to go talk to?
Well,
because when I see somebody out in my field that I don't know, my antennas go.
Yeah, I know. Well, so if the investigator will probably be talking to someone first to find out who to talk to. So, you know, we would want to be directed to someone who's in charge.
Okay.
Yeah, and talk to you.
During harvest, how flexible, I work on a tractor, and for 5 weeks, 7 days a week, it's daylight till dark, even when the people aren't there. And it'd be hard for me, if you show up, to shut down all my machines so that I can go to the office and get the paperwork, and at least it'll take me some time to get hold of somebody that can take you there and just let you go in the books, because I don't care. But I can't just shut down and walk off on 16 people working.
So, I mean, you would have to talk with the investigator on that. What I will tell you is that the regulations require that the records, the payroll and time records, be ready and available for an investigator. And if they're housed at a main office somewhere, that you provide those within 72 hours.
There you go. No problem.
Yeah. So you just have to, you know, convey that. Yes. Sorry.
So I understand that if I do have an investigator come to the field, and I can ask, you know, I can say, I'll be glad to cooperate with you, but I don't like you, I don't want you to talk to my employees now, but you like to have a 72-hour period to produce those. You say, could you come back in 24 hours when I can go to the office, get my records? You have a 72-hour period.
Do you want to address that since you're a manager?
Yeah, no, I mean, we have access to the field and the workers at the time that we're out there. And then the records that you have available, we have authority in the law to be able to take a look at them. What other grower associations I've dealt with is that they sort of do a little prep work right before harvest season in case they get investigated, getting the records together, putting stuff together, just having it available in case they do get a visit, they've got all their ducks in a row. So there's other people that are doing that.
It seems like some of the other meetings I've sat on that, I mean, it's not as cut and dried as that. I mean, if I have my property posted with no trespassing and, you know, you have to go to the office, ask for a person, that you have, you know, that you may not have the right just to come into your field and start talking to your people. If I'm more than happy to say, I want to make an appointment in 24 hours so I can get the people in my organization here that take care of my payroll and the records and have all my ducks in line. And that's 100% not right, or that's what you're telling me?
That's what I'm telling you, that we wouldn't, that's the whole reason why we
Could you
show
use the
up.
microphone so we can hear your word?
That's the whole reason we do a surprise visit, is to be able to, do an investigation that's not tainted, or where the employer's coaching employees to say certain things. So we want to be able to come in and be able to see how things are operating like they probably normally should at that location. So she's talking about the record keeping. You know, if you don't have the records available then, we could get them later. But we had access to the field and be able to talk to workers. Otherwise, if it was the way you're describing it, those workers may not even show up the next day. They might be gone. And therefore, we wouldn't be able to do our investigation.
But do you realize that because you are in that field, those workers may not show up tomorrow anyway?
That's a possibility as well.
I mean, you know,
That's
it works both ways. And then who pays for that? We do.
Let's, we're about at the end, and I think you guys have been great. Are you gonna hang around at all? I know we're gonna take about a 10-minute break or so, and then we've got Mandy to present to. And let's give them a hand.
We've done a lot of ag investigations, and a lot of growers are totally in compliance, or with very minimal violation. You don't hear about that, and so there are a lot of people who try their best to do the right thing. And the problem comes in when you've got some of the others who don't quite, and then they can sell their product at a lower rate, and then that undermines the folks who are trying to do things right, and they have higher expenses. So. Just want to point out that there's a lot of you guys that are doing a lot of things right, and we know it's a lot of work, So, but thank you for being here and wanting to learn a little bit about this.